Please be seated, won't you? Good morning. So, just a little editorial comment before we get started. This is my least favorite gospel to preach on. It is my least favorite gospel to read in the midst of the sanctuary because of the violent imagery that is contained within it. It is a difficult place in the lectionary that comes up. We are a liturgical church, and so our readings are selected decades ago, and we read them at a pattern, and we encounter these hard stories in the Bible. And so I just want to say that I think that this is, we don't pick these, but they're also difficult stories for us to unpack and to understand and to see the reality of what was happening within the gospel. I should have scheduled Kelly to preach today, but she scheduled the mission trip, and it's not fair since it's her first day back. I offered the sermon to George Phillips, but he denied it. I tried. So, a number of years ago, our family went down to Corpus Christi and down to Padre Island, a little further down, and we got a house, and it was our extended family. So Kelly's parents went with us, our brothers, her brothers, and we were pregnant at the time with Asher. So Riley was about three and a half, and we were hanging out by the seaside. It was a great time. It was about this time of year, so it was nice and cool and pleasant in the Gulf of Mexico, and we were having a great time. And my brother-in-law Hudson and I decided we really wanted to find a sand dollar. And we had talked to some local people, and they said, oh yeah, it's out on this. If you swim out a little ways, you can get out to the sandbars. If you just go out, you kind of see where those waves are coming. You can get out there, you can stand up there. There's lots of them out there. That's where the divers go to find them. And, being great people who live not by the ocean and being in, not prime physical shape, Hudson and I began swimming out, not realizing just how far out that was, and also not having that much experience with the ocean. And I found myself getting out too far, tiring out, and I had a very frightening moment where I thought I wasn't going to get out to the sandbar, nor could I get back. And if you've ever swam in the ocean, the waves are incredibly powerful, and this wasn't particularly treacherous sea, just an area that was where the waves were moving, and you lose complete control. Of course, our bodies are 90% water, and so you just sort of are at the mercy of the currents. And when you can't find your footing, right, you begin to tire, and there's a subtle little panic that comes inside of you. To be honest, that's how I feel about our political situation in our country right now. It's out of control, and we are moving back and forth in dangerous waters, and we have no grounding. That's how I felt yesterday as the news was breaking about what happened at the Trump rally in Pennsylvania. Right before the service, when my son called me to tell me what had happened. This is often our pattern. We talk about things in the world. And we were talking a little bit about what happened, and I said, I don't know anything about it. I'll have to learn. But it yet seemed one more moment when the waters and the torrid waves were moving around us, and we were shifting back and forth and not sure what would happen or what it meant or what the realities were. Let's take a minute and shift gears and talk about some of the readings for today and some of the things that are said. Amos, the prophet, comes into the scene of a place that's in that same kind of political upheaval and challenges. And Amos is kind of interesting. He's a shepherd and a dresser of sycamore trees. So you know what that is. That doesn't mean that he put costumes on sycamore trees. What that means is the sycamore is also kind of a fig tree. What it means is they would go and make a tiny little slit on the fruit, and inspect the fruit and pull the bad fruit off, and the tiny little slit would cause the fruit to ripen quicker and would hasten it and make it sweeter and better to sell. So this is delicate work that's precise and very much probably meant getting up into these bushes and trees and different things like that. It's also interesting because part of the job of a prophet is to tell a little bit of truth, right? And to open things to something more, to ripen it, and to bring something out of a place that is in desolation or challenge. So this is Amos, and in the situation, Amos is faced with the head priest who comes and accuses him of making money from his prophecy. That's what the little statement that is in there about. And Amos's response is, I'm just a shepherd. I don't make any money. My living comes from dressing sycamores, and I've been called by God to come and to speak some kind of truth. If we go into the gospel, we have John the Baptizer, who is also a prophet. John comes into the wilderness, and John lives a simple life, eating honey and locusts in the wild. He is sort of crazy. I just have pictures of like this very wild hair, unbathed, out there talking truth, and probably somebody most of us would avoid if we ran into him. And John is speaking the truth and calling Israel and the people who were there into repentance and coming back to the way of God. Coming back to righteousness, which means following God's path. And one of the people that he is most speaking against is Herod. Herod is corrupt, is in cahoots with the Romans, is benefiting and has tremendous wealth. You can go to some of Herod's old houses and properties even to this day. I remember being at the place that is right by the Red Sea where likely some of this would have happened. And it's palatial. It's huge. There was room for chariot races. There is a big amphitheater. And this was one of many of Herod's places. And in the midst of that, John the Baptizer is threatening to Herod. And so Herod does what we hear in the gospel. At the beginning of the gospel, it's about Jesus and who Jesus is. And immediately following this, we will have Jesus' miracles. So Kelly will probably preach next week, and it's going to be on the feeding of the 5,000, I believe, if it follows exactly. Or him, there's all this other stuff that happens. So, yeah. But it is this sort of establishment of who Jesus is. We've heard of several lessons from earlier in Mark about Jesus preaching in the temple, about his presence, and here we have this. And so who is Jesus? And King Herod had heard about him. Some are saying he's John the Baptizer who's been raised from the dead, and Herod is terrified. John is coming back to finish up something. Others say it's Elijah, who again is a prophet and an important player in the Old Testament, and others say Jesus is a prophet. And so when Herod hears of this, we hear the story because Herod is threatened, and it's foreshadowing what will happen to Jesus that we know on Good Friday, and Herod working with Pilate, and all the other realities of that. But I want to focus in on something that I think is really critical here. When he's faced with this, Herod hears of this, and when this thing is happening, and when this daughter, right, of Herodias comes to him and says what she wants, which is a horrible request, which is an immoral request, which is a violent request, what is in the Bible, it says, Herod is deeply grieved. Herod knows that the request is wrong. Herod knows deep down. And yet, out of regard for his social media, he has to keep his oaths because he had said publicly in front of his court and in front of all his guests that she could have whatever she wants. To show Herod's power, this is an echo of another story that we encounter with Jesus when he is out in the desert and is tempted, right? What are the temptations that Jesus faces? But it is to have anything he wants and any power he wants. There is another part of this in which Jesus never gives in to the temptation, right? And this is a story of Herod giving into that. So out of regard to his oaths, out of regard to his guests, he didn't want to refuse her and follows the wrong path. This is what I think is at the heart of the story, is a call to something more. It is seeing that righteousness, right? That path that's before us that we sort of know is right. And what I think we hear in Ephesians and what we hear in this is where our grounding comes as people of faith, is trusting what our heart and what the truth might be. Think about that for a minute in all the challenges that we face in our world. Think of the immigration issue that we're all faced with on a daily basis in different ways and in different places. Think of the epidemic of gun violence within our community as we face all of that. How many of you have been to a sporting event recently and walked through a metal detector? How many of you are students, and when you go to your high school, you walk through a metal detector, you have armed guards sitting at your front of your school, and you practice drills to know what to do when the shooter comes? How many of you face realities in which you fear this very thing happening if you go to large crowds? Or even in the safety and the place that we are now in the church, when sometimes we hear of shootings that happen in places that are set apart to be holy places, or in every aspect of the community, even making a mistake when you're driving and being fearful that someone's reaction might be over the top. Think of the challenges within healthcare and our access to that. Think of the difficulty when we face diagnosis or we face the fear of losing a job and not being able to access the things that keep us alive or the realities that we need. Think of those who are hungry and in the midst of one of the greatest agricultural societies that the world has ever seen, that produces massive food that feeds many people throughout the world, and yet even in our own streets, there are people who are lining up by the hundreds, week after week, at mobile food pantries and in lots of different places to access food that they need to live and to survive. Or what about any other challenge that we might face? The list can go on. And I don't know about you, but sometimes that ocean feels pretty rough and pretty frightening. And I'm not really sure where to swim or where to go. I prayed for President Trump last night, for his safety, for his health. I prayed for his family. I prayed for the others who were shot. I prayed for all who had gathered with them in their terror and in their screams. I prayed for the shooter and for the shooter's family. And I didn't know really what to say to God other than to try to pray. I prayed for President Biden. I prayed for all those that are in power and authority, for the police, for the mayor of that community, for all those, for the Secret Service agents. And I still feel ungrounded. It's not quite enough. One of my colleagues is a woman named Becca Stevens. How many of you have heard of her? Just out of curiosity. So how many of you have heard of Thistle Farms? Yeah. Okay, so she is the one who started Thistle Farms. Thistle Farms, if you don't know, is a ministry in Nashville that was started to help people women in particular, who are on the streets that were in prostitution and other realities, and to love them out of that life and into wholeness by providing opportunities for work and other ways to do things. Becca is an Episcopal priest. She serves at the chapel that is the Episcopal ministry there at Vanderbilt University, right in the middle of that part of town. She's been there as long as she's been part of Thistle Farms. She has a mantra, and I remember hearing this in my first couple of years of ordination. The young clergy of the Episcopal Church gathered for a conference. There was just a few hundred of us that were under 35, and she was there. And I remember we were having these conversations. The presiding bishop was there, other people who were there, and people were talking about the church and its needs and all of the different challenges that the church was facing. And we were these new young leaders coming up. And I remember in her exacerbation of the moment, she just sort of looked at someone who was speaking. I have no idea what the person was saying. And she says, "Isn't it just that we have to love people one person at a time? Can't we just do that and start there?" Her mantra is love the whole world, one person at a time. She has thousands upon thousands of people who are aided by the ministry. She started the ministry, has expanded, and is in hundreds of cities, has places throughout the world. She's never made a dime from the work that she does. Her living comes from the work that she does at the chapel and the church that she serves. And this organization has done phenomenal work being built from that vision and that clarity. What I've always admired about her is she hears that inner voice that Herod missed. She hears the inner voice that Amos said yes to, that the priest of the time couldn't hear. And that is that voice of God calling out in the wilderness, right? Calling out to the righteous path, to the right way. Sometimes we talk about that as a conscience. Sometimes we talk about it as something grounded within us, or that inner voice that we hear. It's that little thing that sometimes says when you're seeing something and you say, it's not quite right. This doesn't feel like the way it should be. This isn't the way it can be. But it's also the voice that lets us find our footing, right? I remember back swimming in the Gulf on that day, having that moment of panic, and finally sort of my brother-in-law sort of saying, "Take a deep breath, just tread water. I'll swim next to you." Smart, he didn't grab me because I probably would have pulled him down. And he said, "Let's just go a little bit." We went a little bit. We went a little further. And then suddenly he said, "Put your feet down." And there the grounding was. And I stood there for a minute, and debated internally if I should tell Kelly what just happened. And decided I don't think I did. I think I waited a little bit since she was pregnant with Asher. But I had a moment, right? But I found that grounding. I'll swim in the ocean again. I've swam in the ocean again since then. I'm a little smarter. I have some wisdom. But I think in these times we have to find our own grounding, and we have to look for that truth and that love in the midst of the ocean that we find all of ourselves in. I can't in one sermon solve the political ills of the world. If I could, I would probably be at one of those rallies speaking. I can't fix the political situation, and I know that people gathered in this room are all over the map in how we think and how we understand the world, as it should be. We all have different understandings and different ways of engaging things, different perspectives and different depths. But we're really called as people of faith to find that grounding in our life. We'll hear that story of the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 in the coming weeks. And we'll hear of other miracles that Jesus offered. And I think when we encounter Jesus, and this is where I think Becca gets her understanding, it's always one person at a time in how Jesus engages the world. It's the leper who comes, who's been cast out, who's left away from the society, who's not allowed to be touched, who's not allowed to attend temple, who's not allowed to gather food or to be at the well or to do all that Jesus encounters and says, I can offer you healing. It is the woman who is bleeding and has been bleeding for years, who's cast out of society, who's far away, that Jesus encounters and offers healing. It is the tax collector who comes to the people and is in a corrupt system that takes money from the people and is accursed, who Jesus comes and encounters and says, your faith makes you well, go and sin no more. It is story after story after story in which Jesus encounters the people that are seeking the path and the groundedness and the love of God, one person at a time. I wanted to offer this because nothing is going to get easy in the coming weeks and months ahead in our society. Words are going to be said, and man, we need to be careful about our words. And we need to maybe be willing to call out people in either party to be careful about what they say. And somehow we need to find that grounding in our own lives to be able to take our love that we have from God and to be empowered to be in the world and to love others one person at a time. Our youth just came back from a really incredible week in Chicago, learning and understanding and ministering each with one another. I think of the folks in our community, in this congregation, who are working in our immigration ministry and who are trying to live out this very thing, one person at a time. Or those who showed up to hand food out at the mobile food pantry yesterday. Or people who walk with those who are sick or ill. Or those of us who minister in all kinds of different ways, and how you minister in your jobs, in your neighborhood, in your schools, to those around you, is that you can find that grounding and stand in the midst of the ocean, and you can love others as God loves you, one person at a time. And sometimes that means speaking truth. Sometimes that means saying something, and sometimes it means living into that reality. The beautiful thing is Amos doesn't stop doing what Amos is called to do, because Amos is called by God to live into this reality and to speak the truth to the power that's before him. John's incredible ministry paved the way for Jesus, and we know much of the rest of the story. And it is the story that reaches through the generations and touches us and teaches us about that love and that redemption that God has. And so it's our turn to love the world one person at a time, to be willing to take that step from where we are and to take that risk. The ocean is moving around us. Maybe we need to tread water for a minute. Maybe we need to just kind of find that path. Maybe we're the person who's going to calmly speak to another person and say, just swim forward a little bit. Now put your feet down. But I think that that's our call right now as we enter this time. And in some ways, it's to not be as fearful as maybe we think we need to be. But it's in that we can find that peace and that grounding. Finally, I want to encourage us to do something different. And that is to be willing to talk to each other out of love in the coming weeks and months ahead. We really need to share our thoughts with each other and to have an open enough environment in our congregation that we can have those conversations. And we do that by knowing that we're bound by Jesus in the world that we're in, not by the world. So take a risk. Take a risk to talk. But also take a risk to love the world, one person at a time. Amen.